everyone, and welcome back to my channel. First off, I want to apologize for not posting a video last week, for anyone that cares. As you know, there's a lot going on in the world right now, and I'm really trying to focus my energy on positive things and trying to be that change. I'm trying to get involved with the community to make changes, and I want to just be proactive. So for this week's video, that's what I'm going to be doing. This week's case is about a young man named Julius Jones. You guys might have heard of his case because it is gaining traction right now in social media. There are celebrities endorsing him like Kim Kardashian and Viola Davis. There's hashtags, petitions, celebrities speaking out. I am here today to hopefully raise awareness about his case and provide you guys with some information and links on how you can help out down below in the description box. So here is Julius's story. So this all takes place in Edmond, Oklahoma in 1999. It's July 28th, it's around 9:30 at night, and a man named Paul Howell is coming home from a day of shopping with his two daughters. They're 7 and 9 at the time, his two little girls, and his sister is also with him. So the four of them get back to Paul's parents' house, and that's where Paul was living at the time with his two little girls. They pull in the driveway, and very soon after they get out of the car, a man approaches them and shoots Paul, and Paul's sister and the two girls run inside, and the shooter drives off with Paul's 1997 GMC Suburban. So shortly after, the police arrive at the scene. They get a description of what happened. They find 2 shell casings. So the only actual witness of who the shooter was Paul's sister, Megan. Megan describes the shooter as a black man wearing a white t-shirt. She said he had a red bandana covering his face, and he was wearing a stocking cap, and about 1 inch of hair was sticking out from underneath the stocking cap. So, the police list this as a homicide and carjacking. They figure that the vehicle was stolen for parts because that was a common practice in the area at the time, and that particular vehicle would get a lot of money for parts. So I want to talk a little bit about this city, Edmond, Oklahoma, where this is all taking place. This is a predominantly white neighborhood, and a lot of the population came when Oklahoma City desegregated, its schools and everything else. And everyone that didn't like this decided to move up to Edmond and create kind of this white sanctuary. This town was deeply rooted in racism, and there are reports of Black people saying that they feel very uncomfortable and not wanted there. Paul Howell, the victim of the shooter, he was a very well-liked member of the community. He was a white male, middle-class, executive insurance agent. He was a deacon at the church. He volunteered in AA. Everyone said Paul was a great guy, so obviously, the community was outraged at his death. There was a huge outcry for justice, and this immediately became a high-profile case. So the next step for the police is to search for Paul's car. They start looking around the city for Paul's car, and on July 30th, 2 days after the murder, they do find Paul's car in a grocery store parking lot on the south side of Oklahoma City. And this location is significant because it is just down the street from a chop shop. And this shop was owned by a man named Kermit Lottie. And the police knew Kermit because he was actually a police informant. So the obvious next step for the police is to go over to Kermit's shop and ask him what he knows about this vehicle. Kermit said he knew about the vehicle and that he was offered to buy it by a man named Liddell King. And then Kermit claims that he would not buy the vehicle because he knew that there was a murder attached to it, because this, like I said, was a high-profile case. It was all over the news. So then the police bring in this guy, Liddell King, for questioning. And Liddell claims that he was just the middleman. He was just there to sell the car, and he didn't have anything to do with the murder or the hijacking of the car. So this is where Julius comes into the story. Liddell gives the police officers the name of Chris Jordan and Julius Jones. He says that the night of the murder, they both showed up at his house. Chris came, and then shortly after, Julius arrived. And he said that Julius was driving this stolen vehicle, the GMC Suburban. And Julius asked Liddell King, "Can you help me sell this vehicle?" And Liddell agreed to help him, not knowing that the owner of the vehicle had just been shot. So then Liddell takes the vehicle, brings it to Kermit, where Kermit refuses to buy the vehicle. So we're right back where we left off there with him. So according to Liddell, he goes back to the two guys, Chris and Julius, and he confronts them saying, did you guys do this murder and rob the vehicle? And Apparently, they confessed to him that they did. Julius says he was the one that shot him, and apparently Chris Jordan was in the car down the road and didn't have anything to do with it and didn't even know that the shooting happened or was going to happen. Liddell also says that the night of the shooting, Julius was wearing the white t-shirt and the bandana. So at this point, Julius is the prime suspect, and the police rule out the possibility of it being anyone else. So before we get any further into this, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about Julius. Julius was described as being a kind and caring person ever since he was a little boy. He was the middle child. He played sports. He was the captain of his high school football team. He played basketball and ran track. He graduated with honors, and he was 11th in his class out of 143 students. And Julius actually received an academic scholarship to the University of Oklahoma, and he played for their basketball team as well. Julius was very close with his siblings, especially his brother Antonio. Antonio would say the two of them were like one person in two different bodies. And he said whenever he got in any kind of confrontation, Julius would always be there to talk him down. And he said that he would have gotten in a lot of fights if it wasn't for Julius. They were a very close family. The boys were close with their dad too. He coached all of their sports growing up. They were just a really tight-knit family. Julius did get into trouble a few times as a teenager for petty theft. He said he wanted to have a few nice things to try to fit in. You know, it's not right to steal, obviously, but teenagers do that stuff. So the summer of the murder in 1999, Julius was 19 years old, and he had started hanging around with Chris Jordan. Chris Jordan was a former classmate and teammate of Julius's. He was on the basketball team with him, but they never really hung around too much in high school. Chris Jordan kind of had a bad reputation. Julius's best friend, Jimmy Lawson, would later say he was really surprised when he ran into Julius and he was with Chris Jordan. Julius kind of brushed it off and said, you know, we're not really that close, we're just hanging around with him. He said he actually started hanging around with him again because Chris wanted Julius to take the ACT test for him to help get into school. So Julius thought, I can help somebody get into school and make some money, why not? So we're going to talk about the night of the murder through the perspective of Julius. Julius was at his parents' house that night, which would have been about 20 minutes away from the scene of the murder. Julius had a spaghetti dinner with his family, and they would play a game of Monopoly, and it was just like an average family game night. Julius's brother, Antonio, went to work at around 9:30. He left the house, and he said that Julius was still at the house when he left. So remember, the murder took place around 9:30, 20 minutes away. Julius said Chris picked him up around 11:30 that night. He said Chris seemed agitated. And, he said, what's going on with you? What's your problem? And Chris was just like, oh, I got into it with someone. We did something and things didn't really go as planned. So Julius was just kind of brushed it off. And the next day, Julius gets a page from Liddell King. And Julius thought this was kind of weird because he didn't really know Liddell. He met him a few months prior through Chris Jordan. And Liddell was looking for Chris, but Julius didn't know where Chris was. So Liddell asked Julius if he could help him move a vehicle. So Julius kind of went back and forth whether or not he should do it. He knew it was wrong, but he didn't really want to say no to that money because Liddell offered to pay him. So Julius drives Liddell's car, and Liddell drives the GMC, the stolen vehicle, down to Kermit's shop. And, Julius is there to provide Liddell a ride home after he drops off the vehicle. When they get there, as we know, Kermit refuses to buy the vehicle because of its history. And Julius says Liddell comes back to him, and he looks all shaken up and worried, and he's like, we got to ditch this vehicle. There's a murder attached to it. And Julius is kind of freaking out. He's regretting ever getting involved with this, but they go down to the grocery store and they drop the vehicle. They then go and find Chris Jordan, and he says that Liddell and Chris kind of walk away into the corner and they had this really intense conversation. And Julius is kind of staying out of it. He can't hear what's going on. But, again, he's regretting getting involved with this. And he says he didn't want to report it to the police because where he grew up and how he was raised, you don't call the police on people. You don't do that. So Friday, 2 days after the murder, the police called Julius's house. And Julius was there, and he answered the phone, and they're asking for Julius. Julius says, no, Julius isn't home, because he's thinking at the time that they're looking for Chris Jordan and whatever he did with this vehicle, and Julius does not want to be a part of it. So after he gets off the phone, Julius leaves the house and he starts walking down the street, and he notices that Chris Jordan is driving towards his house, so he flags him down, and, he must have been going to see him anyway, so he gets in the car with Chris. So Julius tells Chris that the police are calling looking for him, and, what's going on, and Chris is like, don't worry about it. I'll bring you to my brother's house, and you can lay low there for a little while. Just let my brother know that the police are looking for us. And Julius says at the time, he thought that us meant Chris Jordan and his brother, and he still didn't really think that the police were looking for him specifically in relation to this murder. So the police continued to call Julius's house, and at one point one of his siblings answers the phone, and she's like, no, Julius isn't here. And the police end up just going down to Julius's house and surrounding his house with armed officers, demanding that everyone come outside. So obviously his parents and his siblings are terrified. They come outside with their hands up. His mother later said, she was terrified of what could happen because she knows what could happen with police officers and, unarmed citizens. And the police are doing this outside of the house, surrounding the house, because at this point, they didn't even have enough evidence to have a search warrant. This is all that they could do. All they had was the word of a criminal that said, Julius did it. So while all of this is going on, they're tracking down Chris Jordan. And they end up getting him. They find him through a payphone or something. They put him in the police car and they actually drive him to Julius's house. And he's sitting in the car in front of the house with all these cops surrounding it. The whole road is shut down. It's a huge spectacle. So Chris Jordan basically tells them the same thing that Liddell told them. And he pins it all on Julius, and he tells them where he can find the murder weapon inside Julius's house. So with that information, the police are able to get a search warrant, and they go inside the house, and the gun is right where Chris Jordan said it was. But even with that, the police absolutely destroy Julius's parents' house. There's broken glass everywhere, clothes everywhere. They even went in the fridge and emptied the contents of the fridge all over the floor. I've seen pictures of this, and it's unbelievable what they did to the house. So the next morning, the police get an anonymous tip that Julius is at Chris Jordan's brother's house, and they go there and they arrest him. Julius at that point had realized that he was the one that they were looking for because he saw on the news that they went to his parents' house. And, he's terrified. The police are very violent with him. They are saying things like, you're gonna fry. And one of them whispered in his ear, I dare you to run. N-word. And he said they were high-fiving each other, and it was just so terrifying, I'm sure. When he got down to the station, they asked if he wanted to make a statement, but Julius refused to without his lawyer present, which was good. And they did not allow any bail for Julius. Shortly after Julius's arrest, the DA, Bob Macy, made a public statement that he was going to seek the death penalty. And this guy... he seems like a nightmare of a person, to put it nicely. He has a record number of sentencing people to death and just seems like an evil little troll of a man. So Julius was granted 2 court-appointed lawyers, David Mackenzie, who had 0 death penalty experience, and Robin Bruno, who was actually still in law school. David Mitchell said at the time that he had 70 or 80 cases that he was assigned to. So as the lawyers start working on the case, they have some things that would work with them in their defense. They have the eyewitnesses, his family, that said he was there that night. He was still there at 9:30. They have the fact that there's 0 DNA evidence tying Julius to the case. And a huge piece for the defense was the fact that the witness said the shooter had about 1 inch of hair sticking out from his stocking cap. So 9 days before the murder happened, Julius was actually picked up for reckless driving, and he had a mugshot taken. There ended up being no charges filed against Julius for the reckless driving, but you can clearly see in the mugshot he does not have 1 inch of hair that would stick out from the stocking cap. But somebody does. Chris Jordan. Unfortunately, at Julius's trial, the lawyers never even brought this up. Something so huge that could have just planted a seed of doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt, remember, in one of the jurors' heads. And they didn't even try. At the trial, Liddell King testified against Julius, and he said that he confessed to him that he was the shooter. At this point, Julius's lawyers could have confronted him and say, "How well do you know Julius?" Because they were barely even acquaintances. Why would Julius even confess a murder to this guy? But the lawyers didn't even cross-examine Liddell, they just let it go. One of the most damning pieces of evidence against Julius was the fact that that grocery store had him on security cameras, that grocery store where the vehicle was dropped off. Chris Jordan also testified against Julius. He said he was with him that night, he was parked down the street. He didn't actually see Julius shoot Paul, but he heard it. But it's important to note here that when Chris Jordan initially gave his statement to the police, he said that he was right there and he saw Julius shoot Paul. The defense knew about this, but they never brought it up in trial. Julius's lawyer would later say, "I had all these questions prepared. I don't know what happened. I just had a bad day." And when it was time for the defense to present their case, David Mackenzie stood up and simply said, "The defense rests." Julius said he was shocked when he said this. He was confused because this is not what they discussed. David Mitchell claims that he made this decision on his own because he found a prison letter that Julius mailed to his girlfriend that said he was not home the night of the murder. Julius would say, "Yeah, I wasn't home that night after 11:30. It's important to note the timeline." And when David was asked about this, he said, "I don't remember the wording of the letter regarding a timeline." And in 2004, Julius's ex-girlfriend made a statement in an affidavit saying that he never wrote such a letter saying that. She also said that the defense attorneys never even reached out to her prior to the trial. It kind of seems like the defense lawyer was working for the other side. So another part of Chris Jordan's statement was that he spent the night at Julius's house the night after the murder. Chris came to Julius's house saying that he was locked out of his grandma's and could he spend the night there. Julius said he didn't think much of it at the time, even though Chris never spent the night at his house before. But Julius let Chris have his bedroom and he slept on the couch. Now, the gun, the murder weapon, was found in Julius's bedroom. So Julius's jury, they were all white except for one black man. And it was said that several black jurors were struck from the case because they were victims of a crime or that they knew a law enforcement officer. And that they were white members of the jury who fit the description of these same characteristics, but they were allowed to remain on the case. Later on, when Julius got new lawyers and they were trying to grant him an appeal, this was brought up because this could be grounds for a mistrial, and it was denied. So the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, and they came back with a verdict of guilty. The prosecution also used scare tactics on the jury, at one point holding her fingers up to the jury's head as if it were a gun and pulling the trigger. Julius's defense team later called for a mistrial over this, and that was denied as well. So Chris Jordan did go to prison for his part in the crime as well. At his trial, it was presented that he would serve 30 years in prison. But when Chris got to prison, he started bragging to other inmates that he was actually the shooter and that he was only going to be in there for 15 years. So these inmates came forward with this information. And these particular inmates had nothing to gain by doing this. They were already in there for life and they couldn't get anything taken off of their sentence. They just didn't want an innocent man to die for something that he didn't do. But when this was brought to the Court of Appeals for a retrial, again, it was denied because they said the witnesses were not credible. Criminal witnesses were credible enough to pin it all on Julius, but apparently not to grant him an appeal. And the thing about the 15 years actually turned out to be true. Chris Jordan got out early and only served 15 years of his sentence, so he's walking around free. Julius's defense team, they also talked to some of the jurors that were on the trial, and this was just a few years ago. And one of them actually said, "Something's been bothering me for years," and it's that one of the jurors actually said they should just take that N-word out back and shoot him. And this was long before they were even into deliberation. And this particular juror brought the information to the judge because he thought it was obviously wrong that someone like this could have Julius's life in their hands, but the judge didn't do anything about it. So Liddell King also had charges against him at the time. He was facing 20 years in prison. And for testifying against Julius, all the charges were dropped. So, about a week before the murder, there was actually another carjacking in the area, and the evidence pointed to Chris Jordan. And when Chris Jordan was questioned about this, he, again, pinned everything on Julius, and this was after both of them were already in prison. So by the time that other carjacking incident comes to trial, Julius has already been charged with the murder of Paul Howell and that other carjacking. So he's already on death row. He still has hopes of getting this overturned, but for the second carjacking crime, he could have to serve 99 years. So even if he got this murder overturned, he could still be in prison for 99 years if he lost that case. And he knows he could easily lose that case because of how the other case went. So they offer him a deal of 12 years if he pleads guilty. And Julius says he feels like he had no other choice and he took the deal. Julius Jones is still in prison on death row. He's in solitary confinement 23 hours a day, and he's only allowed 1 hour of sunlight a day and 3 showers a week. Again, I will leave his petition down in the description box. If you could please take the time to sign that, that would be great. Also, to raise awareness for Julius, I will link the hashtags and the photos that you can share on social media to raise awareness about his case. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It is a very important one, and it's an important message to share. Thanks again for stopping by, and I'll see you guys next time.